Thanks for joining us. Welcome, welcome. How's everybody's day been so far? Okay? Not full of conflict, I hope. Or maybe full of conflict if that's going to be useful in providing some good example and giving us some things to examine this issue with. Um, so, Colin and I would like to have some time tonight to, for anybody that wants to or would find it useful, to talk about anything that they've had, whether it's hypothetical or actual, around a situation that's provided conflict. But let's talk about a few of the things first that make this topic useful to discuss. Conflict is an inevitable and ubiquitous fact of life, right? We
Nice,
wish.
ubiquitous.
Thank you. I read the dictionary this morning.
Nice.
We would much rather not have to deal with conflict, but oftentimes the only option that we're taught, other than to tackle conflict head on, and therefore run the risk of actually creating conflict where there might not be one, right? Sometimes the anticipation of conflict makes us create a conflict where there hasn't been one presented. That can be really difficult, but it's one of the only tools that we're taught, other than the one that we're taught even more than that, which is to avoid it. Okay? Stay away from conflict, not to get into any situation that produces a feeling of conflict or the potential for conflict. And either that means that we then shrink away from life, because avoiding conflict is like trying to run your life avoiding pain, right? None of us want pain. It's not something that we're looking to experience, but yet it's in all facets of life. And just like stress, pain can sometimes be good if we choose to engage it for reasons that are important to us, like a good run or a good workout, or trying something that's really, really difficult. Playing the guitar, for example. Your fingers are going to hurt for the first while you try to do that. But that's a pain that we can manage because it's a pain that we choose, right? So we're going to take the same approach and the same idea towards the sense of a sense of conflict. Let's start to challenge ourselves and think about the idea that conflict can be something, and it's going to sound a bit strange potentially because you're like, well, why did I choose that? But conflict can be something that we can choose, right? Kind of akin to the idea of like picking your battles. And if we can recognize that we have a choice around conflict, in other words, we have a choice to pick our battles, it can restore that feeling of command around it. In other words, it's like, well, yeah, I don't necessarily want to go through this thing, but I'm not afraid to, or I'm not going to let my fear of going through it stop me because I have a choice in it somehow. Okay, and that's a sort of a theme that we're going to draw upon, this idea of choice and how choice impacts our perception and experience of that which we would automatically classify as conflict. Okay, how's that sound? Any questions on that? Any thoughts or ideas that you want to clarify? If not, we can proceed, but always happy to get any feedback if you've got some that you think would be helpful to you engaging in the conversation. Good to go?
Do I add this in?
Yes, you do.
And some of this is, I do very well in having rules. I kind of dislike rules, and I'm very relieved to have them because for conflict, for me, we've talked about before in here, so some of you will have heard this already. Fight or flight, which way do we go? Do we go into fight, flight, all the F's, right? Fit in, fawn, freeze. And I tend to go into flight and freeze. So people who tend to have more of a prey reaction rather than a predator reaction, and you go more into freeze or flight, you're going to be taught to avoid conflict just by that reaction in your brain. And then the challenge is we try to learn our skill sets in the places that we feel safest. So that means that especially if you have kids, they're going to learn their conflict around you because you are the safe place for them to learn how to handle it. And they're going to have no skill sets around it because it's new for them. So we want really nice, simple rules that you can apply if you're in a state of fight or flight, regardless of what that is, and that you can apply and teach children and respond to children and the person at work who doesn't know how to handle it because they've never been taught. We want it to be nice and easy across the board.
Can we brighten the screen at all?
Maybe.
That's a little better. Nice. Cool. Awesome. So, what is conflict? How does it arise? What are the components that drive it as an energy or a mechanism? Right? And it's a tricky thing to handle because we often don't understand what it actually is. Okay, so in a really simple sense, conflict is oppositional energies and forces trying to occupy the same space. Right? So it's a simple way to think of it. It's like one thing's going one direction, one thing's going the other direction, and they're trying to both occupy the same space at the same time. Okay? It sets up a dynamic that creates what we would commonly think of or call win-lose, right? So that's part of what makes it a scary thing. That's part of what makes it a mechanism that we end up wanting to stay away from. It's the idea that, well, okay, if I get into a conflict with someone in any way, shape, or form, there's a prospect that I'm going to lose, and that's scary in and of itself, right? Because loss, particularly at the hands of someone else who is taking away your choices, generally feels bad, right? It doesn't feel good. So it's something that we're taught to be wary of. Don't lose. Don't be a loser, right? There's a lot of ego dynamics that get wrapped up in that, and it can create a runaway train of anxiety around anticipating running into oppositional energies and forces trying to occupy the same space, right? That's our simple definition of conflict. So there's that fear. The other fear around potential conflict and anticipating it is one that's a little bit more obscure, I guess, and a little bit harder to comprehend until we spell it out really easily. That's the idea of being the winner, right? If conflict is oppositional forces, if it's adversarial action, well then I've got to win or I've got to lose. I know what it's like to be afraid of being the loser, but people can also be afraid of being the winner as well. And that is one that we don't necessarily think of right away, but certainly plays a role because either side of that equation creates the possibility to experience guilt or shame, right? Generally speaking, if you lose, you feel ashamed of yourself. You feel deficient. You feel like you were less than in the situation, okay? Winning as well, too, at the expense of someone else losing, right, is also something that can produce feelings of guilt. And guilt can be the fertile ground that produces feelings of shame. So we can feel bad, okay, after the fact when we have been in a conflict with someone that we've walked away the victor. Well, where do victors occur? Victors occur in that binary dynamic only when there's a victim. So these are some of the mechanisms that make conflict such a anxiety-inducing, kind of stomach-churning potential experience that makes us either obsessive in always being the winner, okay, which we've described and outlined the folly of that, or makes us want to just completely avoid it at all costs. The difficulty is that in life we're going to run into lots of opposition, and opposition is just something that's going in the different in the opposite direction or a different direction than we're going, right? It's facing us. We're trying to go forward. It's trying to go forward in the opposite vector, right? So if you think about opposition in that neutral sense, there's a whole bunch of opposition out there, right, that you've got to learn to face somehow, okay? And anything that we don't make conscious choices about, we have less command and control over. So when we don't make conscious choices about how we are going to set ourselves up to learn and practice dealing with conflict, well then anything that presents the potential for conflict has control over us, right? It shrinks our ability to interact, participate, and make an impact in the world. And that might sound sort of, New Agey and conceptual, but when we think about it, if you're afraid of having a conflict with the barista at Starbucks, that's on the shift 5 days out of the week when you go to work in the morning, well, you better get comfortable with not having your morning coffee unless there's a way you can figure out how to walk into that situation without experiencing the anxiety and the anticipation of feeling guilty or feeling ashamed. Make sense? Any thoughts about that? Any questions along those lines? Anything you want to add, Cole? I know I'm kind of barreling ahead, but I know how quickly our time will go here.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so what is conflict made of? What is this thing that's called energies or forces in opposition to one another trying to occupy the same space? It's got three major components. Okay? And the three major components are chaos, calm, and confusion. Okay? Chaos, calm, and confusion. Okay? What's chaos? Chaos is, just for our purposes, we can have a clear definition for discussion, is an overwhelming amount of unpredictable variables. That's chaos. Right? We get too many things moving at one time in ways that we don't understand or can't predict. That produces that feeling of overwhelm, which fuels anxiety, right? And it kind of becomes a vicious circle that feeds itself. So the more overwhelmed we feel, the more anxious we feel, the more anxious we feel, the more chaotic the experience becomes. The more we perceive the experience as chaotic, the more we feel overwhelmed, the more it feeds our anxiety, and it just keeps looping on top of itself, right? That spinning dynamic gets out of control, and then chaos becomes so unbearable, okay, that we either freeze in the face of it, or we have to turn away and get away from it. That's like trying to drive a car from the back seat, right? If we're not close to the steering wheel, if we're afraid to get up there and push the gas and shift the gears, well, we're not going to have much control over that car. We're not going to feel very safe there, okay? So that's chaos. What's calm? Well, calm we could define as the opposite of chaos, right? There's enough space and time and a few enough variables in the environment to feel like we can predict the variables and predict and have some impact on their action, like what they're doing to us. Okay, it's the opposite of overwhelm. Okay, that's calm. Chaos is overabundance of unpredictable variables. Calm is a comfortable level of variables in any environment that allows us to predict them confidently, right? What they're going to do or how they're going to shape up. If we think about those two concepts, right, on a continuum, chaos on one end, okay, calm on the other end. Obviously, as we move towards calm, things feel less full of conflict. As we move towards chaos, things feel filled with conflict, getting to a point of being unbearably overwhelming. Okay? I want you to think of that continuum with a volume knob. Okay? And that volume knob is confusion. We could parse it out in other different ways, but these are sort of the major things that most people can gravitate to and go, oh yeah, that kind of makes sense. So we're always looking for the common denominators and the most foundational, fundamental elements that we can identify because we want to keep things simple. Okay? Simple is the thing that gets us through heightened situations that induce fight or flight reactions. Okay? So we've got chaos on one end of the continuum, we've got calm on the other end of the continuum, and the volume knob there is confusion. How do you think that works? I'm sure you're probably already thinking of it. The more we turn up the volume of confusion, the more we tend towards experiencing and perceiving whatever situation is as chaotic. Okay? There's a direct connection between the experience of chaos and the presence of confusion, because confusion is the thing that makes the variables that are in any particular situation feel overwhelming, okay, and unpredictable. Okay? Obviously, to the other extent, if we turn down the volume of confusion, okay, we tend towards the spectrum on the other end of the continuum called calm, right? Confusion speeds up the perpetuation of chaos. It also, when turned down, slows down the perpetuation of chaos, which creates more and more and more and more and more variables that are moving more slowly, that are easier to identify, and therefore we become more confident in predicting their action. That's what keeps us calm. Okay? So just to recap, we've got chaos, we've got calm, and we've got confusion. Confusion is the variable, the dial that creates our perception of the experience as either more and more and more chaotic or more and more and more calm. Right? These are things you probably all thought about. The difference of what we're doing here tonight is we're, for the sake of our discussion, calling them specific things, defining those specific things in a way that we can all agree upon for the purpose of discussion, and examining the idea of conflict when we're not in one, right? Which is awesome because unfortunately, that's where most people end up kind of having to learn about how to handle conflict. It's in the face of a conflict, okay? And that is like trying to learn how to thread a needle with, fine white thread when someone's firing a gun over your head, right? We're not going to be present. We're going to be full of anxiety. We're going to be full of fear. We're going to be full of anticipation. We're going to feel like we're under tremendous stress and pressure. So it's not really great to try to learn about something as impactful as the concept and the experience of conflict when we're in the conflict. Does that make sense? I'll take that as a yes. Cool. I'll pause there for any questions, thoughts, and contributions from call.
No, I've got all my contributions for the solution-oriented part
Great. Do we want to?
because I'm solution-oriented.
You are very solution oriented. Do we want to touch on that now and start interweaving that now?
Yeah.
Awesome. Awesome, guys. Hope that makes sense. Hope that's nice and clear. Hope that sets a good foundation for the direction that we're going to talk about this topic further tonight. So thanks for listening and being patient.
Mm-hmm. And solutions. I'm just gonna chime in. You get to do all the heavy lifting, and I just get to come in and be the. No, I'm just gonna come in and be the like solo ballerina that comes in and gets to say something fun, and then hand the heavy lifting back to you.
Oh, okay. I thought you were jumping in. That's which is cool. I just don't like the sound of my own voice that much that I want to overwhelm everybody with how much I've got to say because I've got lots to say on this topic. I've spent a lot of time in my life in various professional and personal situations having to learn how to handle conflict the hard way. Okay, and it's tough. I empathize with anybody that has any anxiety or fear or worry around it, right? Because it's a can feel like a very, very, very vulnerable position to be in. Okay, so if the math that we just laid out around this idea of chaos and calm, right, confusion being the volume knob, holds any water for you, and we can continue to explore it, the steps towards actually handling it are quite simple. Pardon me. Not necessarily easy, okay? But they're not hard because the mechanisms of conflict are hard, okay? What makes conflict hard to handle and makes it seem confusing is the fear and anxiety that it invokes, right? That it triggers and brings up in us. That's what makes it difficult. That can create an illusion for us that there's some mysterious force behind what creates conflict and how some people can magically just get through it unscathed and other people, no matter how hard they try, just seem to keep inviting it into their lives constantly, right? And there's mechanisms that sort of govern that as well too on sort of both ends of the spectrum. Okay, there are people that are so calm all the time or try to project an appearance of that calm all the time that makes them an easy target, okay, for people to bring conflict into their lives. Because that person who's trying to bring that conflict into their lives has an agenda, wants something, and says, oh, well, there's no pushback in this person. Okay? I can step in and I can talk to them any way I want to. And they're not going to give me any pushback. Right? That person becomes very easy to bully, very easy to take advantage of, and very easy to control and steer in the direction that whoever is the person who's a little bit more comfortable being the winner in the situation, right? That's comfortable starting the conflict can take full advantage of. Okay, so we don't want to be that person either. Okay, we don't want to be fixated anywhere on any part of the spectrum. Go. What's Maya? I think has a question. Were you waving your hand?
Yes. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, perfect. So I completely agree, but I've gone through a lot of stuff in the last 6 years around, not 6 years, 6 months around this stuff. But when you talk about being the calm one and being able to be pushed over and taken advantage, what about the sort of the person who's able to stay calm when that conflict comes in,
Mm,
but also doesn't play into that drama or conflict.
for sure.
Now the person who's delivering it is not getting the reaction that they want
Absolutely.
because the person is staying calm. So in that case, they wouldn't be pushed over that way. They're just not playing their game.
Absolutely. 1,000%. And
Okay.
great question and great thought. And as always happens, as soon as we start talking about this stuff, everybody starts to like kind of thinking ahead of me, which is great. I love it because it means that we're igniting some truth of your own experience in you and you're starting to think with it yourself, right? Which is what we always want because it doesn't matter how I handle conflict more than it matters how I might share some experiences with you about how I handle it and how you then make that your own, right, to handle conflict. So I'm going to describe what you just asked about in a way using two other sort of human emotions, right? And those two human emotions are boredom, okay, and what people call serenity, right? Like feeling peaceful and serene, okay? They look very similar, right? And sometimes a person who's bored can look really serene, and sometimes a person who's serene can look really bored. But our internal experience while we're in either of those states is very, very, very different, right? The chief way in which that difference occurs is in awareness. Okay, so people who are peaceful and serene are generally very, very, very aware of their environment. Like they know what's going on around them, right? It doesn't necessarily show in their outward action, but if you were to be able to jump inside their head and look throughout their eyes, they're not missing much of anything. Okay, people who are bored tend to be dwindling in their awareness. Okay, they tend to be getting sort of more sucked into their own heads and more introverted and more kind of caught up in what's going on inside of them because they're not finding anything in the environment very stimulating, so they're not paying attention to it as well. Okay, so the reason why I'm describing it like that is we can have two states of being that look very similar but have very, very different foundations and energies driving them. Why is that important? When we're talking about someone who's so calm, okay, that they're very, very hard to quote unquote pick a fight with or provoke or get a trigger out of. What happens in dynamics where a person is intent upon creating a conflict, in other words, I'm bringing chaos to your calm, okay, is that they're just going to keep escalating their action most of the time. So that idea of, well, if I'm just calm, that will handle the conflict is a bit of a false illusion, okay? Because if I'm really intent on bringing conflict to you, okay, well then if you show me that you're only going to respond calmly to the point where it becomes almost monotone, I'm just going to take that as an invitation to step into that space and occupy that territory that I want, okay? The thing that actually... And we're kind of taught a lot of times, oh, just stay calm, just stay calm, just stay calm. That'll sort of help us weather this, okay? And occasionally it works, but it's like the roll of the dice. And the reason why it's like the roll of the dice is because what usually stops the conflict in that scenario, okay, is that the person who's bringing the chaos has decided that the thing that they thought they wanted from you isn't of as much value as they thought it was. So they stop and they move on to something else. They move on to someone who might be easier. They move on to someone who might be harder, actually, because what they do want is actually to get a reaction, right? To feed their energy to keep bringing chaos to you. So that can work sometimes, okay, in the manner that I'm describing it. And tell me if I'm misinterpreting you at all. But it's not effective in terms of its predictability in handling conflict confidently and consistently, right? Again, it's like rolling the dice. Sometimes it'll get you out of the situation, okay? Because it also presents a face that makes it look like you're just kind of tolerating the conflict. You're tolerating the chaos that's coming at you. You're just going to I'm going to just stay calm and put up with it till it goes away, right? And the times where that person is really intent upon making sure that you lose, or that they get from you what it is that they came to bring the chaos to dishevel you and take, they're just going to get more infused with the confidence that, oh yeah, this is working. This person's not opposing me at all. Awesome. Okay. in my martial arts background, I've spent lots of time working with law enforcement and military personnel and studying and reading about, violent conflict, right? And generally speaking, in the criminal world, and hopefully this example will translate in sort of the communication and conversational world, but in the criminal world, I want easy targets. I don't want opposition, right? I want someone who's going to just collapse the minute.
Also, Dana is not a criminal. Case.
Other lifetime.
Case for women. Yeah.
I want someone who's just going to easily collapse, right? That I can just move in on, present my chaos to them. They just fold up like a cheap tent and give me whatever it is that I want. Okay. So when people are used to being right, expressing their ego, projecting their ego on you in order to get their way and get the things that they want from you, then that appearance of being calm and calm all the time, okay, can start to look monotone, look like a lack of resistance, look like a lack of you being present and aware, and it's just an invitation for them to just step further in and occupy all that space. Okay? Does that make sense?
Can I add to that a little bit?
Of course.
So if I get in depth a little bit more about that, it's not necessarily just as you're being calm. Like if I'm being in, I've actually mastered a lot of things in the last little bit. I'm so proud of myself.
Awesome. I'm proud of you too.
I've learned a lot from you guys.
It sounds awesome.
But so the calmness mostly is when there is a conflict and it's such an opposite parts of one, both are right, but different views, opposite, complete views about something. The calmness comes from not getting triggered about what's being pushed onto me.
Yes. And
it's also me not being quiet and just letting it come this way and being monotone. Me, it's calm. I don't get triggered from it.
Awesome.
But I will hold my ground in a very politeful way and agree to disagree on the situation, but I won't give them space to continue to go with the conflict win. I will put a border down and say, this is enough for me. Yep. It's a fight of your own and I'm not taking any part in it. I've given you my opinion and we're not agreeing. We're not seeing the same eye. We're done this conversation. And I have to say, my kids have been a big part in, if they've been around in any point of any of that, it's taught me the calmness, but also showing the confidence and that side of how to deliver and be respectful, but not letting anyone else push you around. So they actually see in like, Mama is really confident. She's holding her ground. She's not losing her temper, but she's not letting being pushed over. So the calmness on being sturdy and what you allow coming your way, like putting a stop to it, but not getting feisty about it. It's just, sorry, but doesn't work for me.
Yeah, I love it.
And it's done. And it's like, if you want to pick a fight, I'm not part of that fight.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
More of what I meant. Yeah.
Yeah. I know. I totally get that. And again, actually, you're describing sort of the next step of what we're talking about, right? Because in the way that we're codifying this, I wouldn't necessarily call that calm. Okay. I would call that confident. Okay. And the reason why I want to make that distinction is because there's a specific mechanism that creates the opportunity for confidence to follow the calm or to come from the calm and start to fill up the space that the other person's trying to occupy. Okay. Yeah. And it's happening in a way that most of the time, unless you really take a look and study what these dynamics are, we're not going to simply catch. Okay. And it's the opposite of what most people try to do when they're trying to maintain what I'm calling a monotone of calm, right? Because in what you described, there was calm, then there was some escalation into confidence, right? That's not monotone. The rhythm's changing, okay? Whereas when people are just like, no, I'm just going to be calm, I'm just going to be calm, I'm just going to be calm, that's the trap that they can fall into that will work sometimes, okay? And will almost never work, okay, as the person who's bringing the chaos is escalating. Okay, so if you are calm and you meet chaos and the person brings chaos and you're calm in the chaos, the reason why the chaos stops isn't necessarily because you're calm. It's because the person has changed their plan, right? But if you're calm and they keep escalating, maintaining a monotone of calm is going to just give them an invitation to keep escalating. What we're talking about here is acceptance. the only way that confidence comes out of calm, okay, that allows you to start changing the rhythm of the dynamic that you're engaged in, is because you've accepted some of the chaos, right? You've accepted it. You've acknowledged it. You've gotten present with it, okay? Oftentimes, what people do when they're trying to maintain a monotone of calm, okay, is they kind of do this. La 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 la, right? They try to deny that there's chaos coming at them. Okay? So what you described was full of acceptance. That's why the calm can start to translate into confidence. Okay? And the step that we're going to arrive at is going to address, the step that we're going to arrive at next is going to address directly, okay, this idea of how confusion works as a volume knob. Okay? So, in your example, which is beautiful, thanks for sharing it, when you allowed yourself to accept some of the chaos, okay, and go, oh yeah, well this is at a rhythm I don't really want. And I'm going to acknowledge that it's at a rhythm that I don't really want. So now that I've acknowledged that it's at a rhythm I don't really want, the natural match for me to handle that rhythm is to get a bit more confident, right? What does confidence do? Confidence allows you to stay in a space of awareness and responsiveness that gets you to another C that governs this whole conflict dynamic, and it's the antidote to confusion. Okay? The antidote to confusion, you're probably already thinking of it, is clarity. Right? Clarity. That allows you to accept the chaos, acknowledge the level of confusion that's being presented in the chaos, meet it with confidence, and understand that in order to calm the chaos, you got to turn down the volume of the confusion, right? How do you do that? By introducing clarity. What's clarity in that situation? Exactly what you just said it was. Oh, I'm going to speak up. I'm going to let people know that I don't want to engage in this. I'm going to make sure that that person understands that I'm not looking for a fight with them on any level. I'm going to let this person know that I'm also not going to be pushed back into agreement with them just because they're standing here getting intense or intentful in proving their point, right? All of those things come from clarity. You're creating clarity in the situation and saying, you're waving all this stuff in my face, trying to push me back and get me to collapse into collapse in confusion so that I'm calm enough for you to take advantage of me, right? But when you actually allow yourself to accept that there's actual chaos in the environment, okay, that's presenting itself to you, trying to have an impact on you, and you don't deny it, you don't run away from it, you stand there and you accept it, it makes you feel more confident because you're like, oh, okay, I know what's going on, right? From confidence comes that clarity. From the clarity, we can turn down the confusion dial. Okay? Now, that's particularly important and impactful when that person realizes that you're trying to do that and then ramps up even higher, right? And turns up their volume, gets more intentful, gets more physically intimidating, tries to push forward on you. Okay? Where people will collapse is in exactly the same place. If they don't accept that reality, right? Because it's scary to face chaos. It's scary to face someone who's intentfully trying to bring conflict your way. Then they collapse, right? Then that person gets an invitation to keep encroaching forward and taking that space. But if you do the same thing you did the first time, which is go, okay, I expressed clarity. I tried to dial down the confusion because obviously you have some confusion about who you think I am. That one, I'm going to fall for your bullying. Two, I want to get into a fight with you. Or that three, I'm just going to run away and let you take over. When we produce that clarity, it creates confidence. When we act confidently again, guess what it does? It creates more clarity, right? So then you can stand there and hold your space. You can be responsive and say, no, actually, from the fact that you're now getting even more intense about this, it's obvious that you're confused about where I'm coming from. I'm actually not trying to fight with you. I don't want to fight with you, but I also don't want to be bullied by you or taken advantage of by you. So I'm letting you know that right now in this situation, I'm not going to participate in this dynamic like this. If you want to talk to me, you can talk to me. You can explain to me what it is that's making you approach me with all this energy and intensity, or you can walk away. Okay? That's what I'm talking about in terms of the semblance of calmness sometimes doesn't always work in handling conflict, right? Particularly when that person escalates it and continues to. Unfortunately, what will happen is if we're in that monotone space of calm, what's going on in sort of the mechanics of what we're talking about is that the chaos is just going to keep rising, right? That person's going to go, oh, I'm winning here. And they're going to keep pressing in and keep adding more confusion, right? So that's step number one, okay? Introduce the thing that's the antidote to the confusion, which is clarity, right? And we can talk in a second about, I hope I was giving you some specific examples of how to do that, but we'll get even more specific about what that actually means and what it actually looks like in a second. But I just want to check in, make sure that makes sense. That was quite a bit of info. Thanks for listening. And see if anybody has any questions or any thoughts, or if Colin wants to say anything, because I've talked lots. Making sense so far?
Yep. And some of that on the flip side, because those of you who are thinking about conflict with children, conflict with partners, we don't necessarily want to make them the bad guy in this example, that they're trying to bring chaos to us. And some of that is somebody can be bringing chaos without meaning to be. Mm-hmm. And the other thing is when we respond with collapse, because we tend to go into freeze or we tend to go into fight, then what can happen is then the other person feels like they're being put in the position of, well, now you're acting like I'm the one who's creating the chaos. Now you're acting like I'm the bad guy. So part of having some rules to follow through this is so that we can, my grammar was weird there, but so that we can we can respond to the other person rather than react. And then we can deal with what they're doing without having our reaction be something that then triggers them to, on some level, go, but I'm not the bad guy. I'm not trying to be a jerk. I'm not trying to be a jerk. I just want to know what we're having for dinner, or whatever it is. I'm just having a bad day. I just need to be able to yell a bit. Whatever the story is.
Well, and that introduces the idea as well, too, which is something that's really comforting, actually, in dealing with conflict, is that most of the time, people aren't intentfully, consciously, and willfully trying to bring chaos to create conflict into your life, okay? It works both ways. Oftentimes, while a person ends up on the heels of what Cole's saying, looking like they're trying to bring conflict and chaos, is simply because they're confused. That's it. They're confused too. Okay? And confusion is a lack of information, right, in present time, where we don't know what's happening because we're missing some information around the things that look like they're unfolding in front of us. Okay? So if we can learn to handle conflict in situations where a person is consciously, intentfully, and willfully bringing chaos our way in order to sow and perpetuate confusion, then handling it when the people are doing it by accident or because they're missing some information becomes way easier. Okay? And it's a really wonderful thing to acknowledge the possibility of, because most of the time, in most situations, in most communication cycles, most conversations throughout the day, most of the time, if people appear like they're about to get into conflict or are bringing conflict to you, it's because they're confused about something. Okay? That's where clarity, right, as the energy that is the antidote to confusion, is fantastic. If we can face someone who's bringing us what looks like conflict, what looks like chaos, with a calm demeanor that says, okay, well, that's really strange that you're getting upset with me about this, because that thing that you're describing happened before I got here today. I wasn't even at work at the time that went down. So are you sure that it looks like what it was? Okay. And I'm kind of slipping into the next step, which is when you understand that clarity is the antidote to confusion, okay, then you're going to do the thing that naturally produces clarity, right, which is ask questions. Right? You're going to ask questions. You're going to inquire. Okay? And, of course, we can do that in one of two ways, right? And I would say, let's use the word inquire as the path towards getting clarity, because in an ego-driven state, in a place where we're all full of fight and fire, and we're all worked up, we could ask questions, okay, but they can be antagonistic questions, they can be provocative questions, they can be adversarial questions, right? Where somebody comes in and says something like, "Oh, well, hey, Dana, did you use the last bit of toner in the printer and not replace it? That was really difficult because I had to print a bunch of stuff," right? And I could ask a question there with the wrong spirit, not searching for clarity, with a desire to add confusion, and have it be something like, "Well, yeah, you think I'm stupid enough to do that? Why would I do that? You probably did it," right? That's questioning, right? But it's not with the spirit of finding more clarity, okay? That's actually with the spirit of sowing more confusion, making that person doubt themselves, making that person feel put upon and attacked, whether they're entirely aware that they were presenting themselves that way or not. And it's magical. And I learned this in my work, in my sessions that I run with people, in the group stuff that we do. And even when I was back in university and working security and bouncing in nightclubs and bars, it's amazing what you can do when you are confidently calm, okay, and are looking for clarity in a situation. It's like a light switch can turn on for that other person, right? And I had that. I've so many times happened to me when I was doing security and bouncing in environments where people are hyped up and sometimes intoxicated in some form or another and full of fire and looking for antagonism. The minute I introduce clarity, the person oftentimes realizes how confused they are. It sounds weird, right? But they recognize how confused they are, and then in that moment of work, they're like, "Oh, yeah, okay, I was really confused about the fact that, you're a black guy, and the other black guy that's in the club, he was the other bouncer, and he threw me out, but that's not you, because his head was shaved and your hair's long. So I was confused about who you were." The minute that you point out to them that it's okay that they were confused and that it's okay for them to be confused, they just calm right down.
Well, and the other part of that is when you're looking at any perceived power imbalance, and perceived is important, whether that's children looking to parents and assuming they're going to not be listened to, or one member of a couple where one of them gets louder faster, and that's Dana's never louder than I am, as you've all noticed. So part of the challenge of that is we look for those cues to see if there's danger and conflict, and we interpret them. And that's where the clarity comes in and the questioning comes in. Because one of the things that I learned to do quite early in the clinic was not to do this face. Because people would say something, I'd be like, "Hey, how's the new formula treating you?" And they tell me something, and I'd think, "That's not what it was." No, and I'd get that face, and they'd say, "Oh, but I feel great. I'm sleeping a lot." And I'm thinking, "You're sleeping? I'm glad you're sleeping. That shouldn't be making you sleep." And the face, the confused face, looks a lot like the angry face. And when you have someone, so Dana's larger than I am, Dana's louder than I am, so I do something, he gets confused. If you do your confused face.
No, that's not it. It's more along the lines of,
Yes. And that face looks a lot like his angry face. So now I am reacting and not responding to angry face. And if I don't take the opportunity because I don't know how to, or he doesn't take the opportunity for either of us to start asking questions, then I escalate because I'm like, "Why are you getting mad at me? I didn't do anything." So that's where the questioning comes in for those perceived power changes.
And in my other former life, as an educator and a teacher for many years, I also learned that these dynamics work wonders with children too, right? Because if we can understand that in most people's experience, okay, confusion, right, especially chronic confusion, is the seed of chaos. It sows the seeds for chaos, right? So we want to think of handling conflict as not a victory as such, but as something that gives us an opportunity to make progress, right? So we're not trying to win, we're just trying to make progress. How do we measure progress in any situation? By the most people who benefit, from whatever it is we're involved in, right? So if we can recognize that bringing clarity and asking clarifying questions will help settle the confusion in any situation, then what we're doing is we're giving everybody an opportunity to be a little less anxious and afraid of the potential for chaos. Because generally speaking, on some level, in most situations, and I mean, and there are extremes at both ends, right? Where people handle their confusion beautifully well, are very self-aware, know how to inquire to make sure that as they approach you, they're approaching you with clarifying questions because they already know that they're confused, right, about something. And then there's people on the other end of the spectrum, okay, that unfortunately have an intent to sow chaos just because.
It sounds like clarity is mainly focused on the dynamics of the conflict rather than the more personal variable, like knowing oneself, i.e. clarity about self.
I love it. That's fantastic. Very much so, if I'm understanding you correctly. That's why we want to shift our thinking or create the possibility that it's not about victory, right? Handling a conflict is, oh, I won. That person, I stopped the conflict. Yeah. It's about creating progress, okay, which is going to be easier to experience when everybody involved in the dynamic is less confused, right? If the person who is feeling that they're being pressured into conflict is less confused about why they're being pressured, why they're perceiving that they're being pressured into conflict, that's great. If the person who is being perceived as bringing the chaos and pressuring the conflict realizes that they've got some confusion, okay, that makes them start to anticipate the chaos that might come and the conflict that might ensue, that's fantastic too. Because what happens when that starts to get, when confusion starts to get carried away, okay, and both parties are just feeding the confusion, the chaos starts to become like a hot potato, right? And we keep trying to throw it back and forth to each other because we're always trying to find a source for it. We're always trying to find a source for the conflict and a source for the chaos. If we can remember that in that moment, it's the energy of confusion that's fueling and driving the appearance of chaos, right? Well, then we can soothe that energy as opposed to passing the hot chaos rock back and forth. Because chaos is such a powerful and primal expression of fear or experience of how we express fear that right away we don't want to take responsibility for it, right? Unfortunately, in that dynamic, when we're both triggered, we're both full of reactionary energy, the only options are chaos or calm, black and white, right? There's no mitigator between the two of those polarities, okay? So if you don't want to be the chaotic one, well, then your only choice is to be forced into the role of being the calm one and maintaining the stability of that calmness in that kind of monotone fashion we were describing earlier, right? Because you're like, well, that's the only thing that's going to mitigate the tremendous amount of chaos that's potentially going to start expressing itself here. Okay? If you don't feel like that's effective, well, then your only other option, okay, if we're not recognizing the dynamics and the mechanics that confusion play in this scenario, is to then out chaos the chaos, right? You got to turn it up so much that you then force the other person into the binary polarity of calmness, not because you want to progress or move the situation forward and calm the entire situation, but because you want to make yourself feel better and make the other person take the burden, right, of limited choice. So it's either they win or you win. They lose or you lose. What we're proposing here in this idea of shifting that paradigm and looking at it from a not a victory standpoint, but a progress standpoint, recognizing that, hey, maybe there's another cause for the appearance of this chaos that isn't directly tied to it being that person's fault, completely all them, or completely all my fault, right? So when we're talking about confusion, we're talking about recognizing the most important variable in the scenario that's seeming full of conflict and chaos that we can put our attention to, identify, and start to actually create other possibilities other than, well, I'm right 100% of the time and they're wrong 100% of the time, or vice versa.
We have 4 minutes before questions.
Oh my goodness.
Do we
See, look how fast that time
do
goes.
we want to get any other data to people in the next 4 minutes?
I think those are the nuts and bolts. I mean, we would never propose that a topic as kind of vast as this around communication, we could sew it all up in 1 hour, right? The goal today was to introduce some concepts and some possible new ways of thinking about conflict, what it is, how to handle it, how to identify when it's about to ensue, and give you some possibilities that there's another way to move through the world with a new kind of confidence around handling things that appear like conflict.
So, do we add that part in?
Yeah, but in a second when we give people a chance to
Okay.
chime in.
Okay. People have messaged me a few questions, and do people have questions? Because there's more. Those are just the basic steps. And again, that questioning is probably the most important thing and the most challenging thing for people, because to get to that state of questioning, can't do it in a state of freeze. And if you've been taught in all of those F's from fight, flight, freeze, fit in, and fawn, well, fitting in and fawning, you're not really supposed to ask questions. Freeze, you can't ask questions. And flight, I guess you can shout them over your shoulder as you go. So that's the challenge for people, is having this as, this is what I'm going to do next time. Next time so-and-so does so-and-so, I'm going to ask questions about this. I'm going to be curious about something. It gives you a roadmap going in, rather than trying to handle it with instincts in the moment, because your instincts are going to say, do what you normally do.